Hi, Vikings. Welcome in. Let's talk about one of our foundational documents, definitely the most important document of the course. It is the Constitution. In the description box, I will make sure and link this link or include this link basically that talks about the Constitution, but it also annotates it with modern day translations. I definitely recommend you take a look at that because the Constitution is difficult to read because it was written over 200 years ago and the language is not as friendly and is maybe more difficult for us to understand, or they'll use different vocabulary that may confuse us. So what's our enduring understanding around the Constitution? It says the Constitution emerged from the debate about the weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation as a blueprint for limited government. So the problems of the Articles of Confederation, which was the basically form of government before the Constitution that America had, problems were basically the states were fighting, it was very chaotic, and that the Congress had no power to tax. So they could only ask the states for money, and most times the states were like, no, thank you, we're not going to give you money. And then also no strong military to stop a problem like a Shays Rebellion, basically. And all of those weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation allowed for a stronger constitution, allowed for a better system that would be able to manage the states. So it established the goals of government as well as sets up the structure with the three-branch system and their roles within the government. We call that separation of powers, the three separate branches. And then also that they have checks and balances embedded throughout the Constitution, weaved throughout the Constitution that basically allow for branches to check each other and balance out power. So Constitution has another enduring understanding, and that's the Constitution created a competitive policy-making process to ensure the people's will is represented and that freedom is preserved, basically. So the Constitution allows for multiple access points for people to influence policy, for the citizens to influence policy, for members of Congress to influence policy, for a president to influence policy, or interest groups, political parties. All in the name of basically making sure that people are represented and that we also preserve freedom, basically. So establish the role of each branch in making policy, right? Congress writes the law, writes policy, but the president also signs bills into law, so also is involved in that policy making, that law-making process. And that the courts are there to interpret the laws, basically. Developed a complicated bill process to ensure laws are beneficial to the country and to protect citizens' rights. Why is the way that we create laws, why is that complicated? Because it actually requires two different houses. It requires the House of Representatives and the Senate to agree to the same language of legislation, basically. So making sure that the states are still represented and that they're not being taken advantage of, because if there was a bill that came from the House that threatened the states, the individual states, then the senators in those states could say, let's go ahead and block that bill. Another enduring understanding, so many of these, because again, our Constitution is a key document. The Constitution also allows for a system called federalism. And federalism is the division of both federal and state powers, basically, the division of powers between the states and the national government. And it's a dynamic distribution of power. Why do we call it dynamic? Because it's evolving and it's changing, basically. And there's competitions over who has power to do what, basically. So it established the relationships between the states and the federal government, outlining the reserved powers for the states, the delegated powers for the federal government, and the concurrent powers for both, basically. So we did in class a Venn diagram where we basically identified what powers are exclusive to the national government. We also sometimes call them express powers, clearly expressed. The reserve powers that are just for the states, and then the powers that they share. We call those concurrent powers, basically. So it limits what the states can and cannot do in Article 4 as well. Article 4 basically talks about this is what states are allowed to do, and this is what states are not allowed to do, basically. And the 10th Amendment is what gives us the reserved powers, 10th Amendment reserved powers for the states. So what are the main ideas in the Constitution? The Constitution outlines the structure of government. Basically, it's the plan for how do we elect officials and how long do they serve and how do we make policy and laws? How do we govern? We have that three branches of government system and we call separation of powers because they're three separate branches. Yes, they interact with each other, but they each have their own roles, basically. And they have checks and balances to prevent tyranny. So if a president becomes, tyrannical or an autocratic leader tries to threaten democracy, that the Congress has the right to impeach and remove that president through the impeachment and removal process through the House and the Senate. It defines the relationship between the states. Article 5 also outlines the amendment process, how do we make an addition to the Constitution? And the process seems simple. It's only 2 steps, but it's very difficult to do. And the Constitution has only been amended 27 times in our history, formally amended 27 times. The amendment process is you need 2/3 of Congress to propose, 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose an amendment, and then to approve the amendment, to actually make it part of the Constitution, you then need 3/4 of the states to ratify or approve that amendment. So we have 27 amendments, including the Bill of Rights. And don't forget that the Federalist Papers 10, 51, 70, and 78 explain and defend different parts of the Constitution. That those Federalist Papers were written to basically explain what the Constitution is and defend why it's a great system and why it's going to be a really good form of government and a really good system that's going to allow for access for citizens, but also allow for protection of citizens. So what's our Constitution summary, basically? You don't need to know the specific, like what's Article 1, 2, 3. They don't really get into that kind of details. But Article 1 is basically the Congress. And it's almost like 50% of the Constitution is Article 1, basically. So the founders really did intend for the legislative branch to be the most powerful. And they gave that branch specifically lots of power and lots of control over the other 2 branches as well. Article 2 is the presidency, the term, the qualification, duties, and powers. Article 3 is the courts, the judicial system, establishes the Supreme Court, and allows Congress to establish lower courts. Article 4 is basically the rights of the individual states, and then also how do we add new states. Article 5 is basically how we can amend, what's the amendment process. Article 6 has basically the supremacy clause, which says that the laws of the federal government and the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. So if you have a state law and a federal law and they conflict with each other, the federal law always wins out. And then the last one is basically how do we approve this Constitution? They said 9 states would be needed for ratification, 9 out of 13. Okay, so what amendments do we need to know, basically? Because they're 27, but they're not going to ask us about all 27. So they're going to ask us about the first, definitely the Bill of Rights. They'll ask you about all of those potentially. First Amendment, freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. 2, the right to own and bear arms. 3, no quartering of soldiers. 3 is not likely to be asked about. 3 and 7 tend to not appear on the exam. 4, knock on the door. No illegal search and seizures. 5, no self-incrimination. Also due process. 5, due process of life. 6, lawyer will fix. Right to a speedy trial, basically rights of the accused. 7, right to jury trial in a civil case. 8 is protection against no excessive fines, no cruel and unusual punishments. 9 basically says just because we listed a bunch of rights doesn't mean it's an exclusive list. So don't think that just because that we have a specific number, there's others that exist too. So don't say that can't be used as a way to deny someone's rights. And then 10, that the states have reserved powers, basically. Okay. So additional amendments, again, we don't need to know all of them. We should know 14, that defines citizenship. It also limits states from violating equal protection, and it's the source of selective incorporation. That's basically the applying the Bill of Rights to the states. The 14th Amendment is the vehicle for that, basically. 15, basically no voting discriminations based on race. 17, now we elect our senators through direct popular vote. Before it was actually through the state legislatures. So direct popular votes is now how we elect our senators. 19, gave women the right to vote. 22, only 2 terms for a president. So that limits presidential power. 24, poll taxes no more. Basically bars poll taxes in federal elections. And then 26, young votes in the mix. It lowers the legal voting age to 18. So what could we use this document for, basically? Like how would we maybe be asked to use it or defend it in an argument essay? It could be used to connect to the system of checks and balances and separation of powers. It relates to foundational document Federalist 51, which basically outlines that system and defends it. It could explain how weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation were addressed in the U.S. Constitution. You could connect the concept of federalism and the distribution of power between the states and the federal governments. So if the question was surrounding federalism, the Constitution would be a great source of evidence. It addresses how voting rights were expanded through the amendments, right? 15, 17, 19, 24, and 26 all expanded voting rights, basically, and encouraged suffrage. universal suffrage. Connect the 14th Amendment to the, sorry, I'm just getting my head out of there. Connect the 14th Amendment's due process and equal protection clauses, or to connect to that concept of selective incorporation. We could use the Constitution for that as well. To address how presidential power was limited by the 22nd Amendment. We could also explain how the people's will is representative through a Republican form of government. Or explain how the Constitution promotes a policymaking process that is beneficial to citizens, that both protects the citizens, but also protects individual freedoms, basically. So a lot of things that we could use the Constitution for, because it is our basically, of the foundational documents, it is the most important, no doubt. So make sure you know your Constitution, make sure you understand just the individual pieces and parts of it, understand that system of separation of powers, and also understand how the Constitution has enhanced representative government, basically, and enhanced participation, political participation for the citizens in this country. All right, do you have any questions on the Constitution? You can go ahead and put them in the description box below, or you can always send me an email. This document overview was a little bit longer than my other ones, but I think it's really, really important, and we needed to take the time because this document is so important. The Constitution, it is the most foundational of all the documents. So please know your Constitution. It's very, very important. And I think the other important thing that we need to do is we can subscribe up here. We can watch a bunch of other videos over here. But most importantly, we should always keep calm and Viking on.